they don't like the nation state, or at least the nation, perhaps more correctly, because the nation represents an actual people, a collective that can stand up and oppose its power. People are looking for the roots to find out, why does it bother me that Christianity is collapsing? How do we bring that energy back in that allows men to evolve into what they truly are? So many of us are so closed off to this. We don't know how to handle and manage these very delicate and profound parts of ourselves. So they're just almost funneled into the narrowness of modernity. That structure of I'm moral if I accept the other, quote unquote, that is the core, almost semi pseudo religious ideology of the liberal. I'm good, I'm going to point the finger at you, and I'm going to be this sort of holier than thou figure. But none of it's really real.
On the show today, Richard, he's one of my favorite YouTubers out there. He's someone I listen to almost every day. Really, really good content about psychology, male initiation, immigration, the state of the world, just so many good topics. Also known as Richard the Fourth. He's also a men's coach and someone I am very, very happy to welcome to the show. So, Richard, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Glad to be here.
Let's dive in. Why are so many young men and men generally lacking a sense of purpose today?
Well, it's a massive question. I think this one has probably been a big question for the last 10 years or so. And I think there have been many attempts to answer it. I mean, I think starting from the very top, it would be in my view at least, the way our society, our civilization is structured at the moment. Ultimately, society, life, it's all oriented around the idea of getting things for the individual self. It's very much the ideology I grew up with. Grew up very secular, in the Midlands, in the middle class, in the middle of that. Everything was the middle with me, so pretty average experience. And I found myself in my late 20s chasing everything in the world while my soul was almost breaking apart inside of me, but not having the language to express and explain that. And I kind of intuitively was very wary of what the mainstream was doing, still doing it now. Men need to talk about their feelings. I sort of sensed that was a trap early on. Now, I'm not against men sharing their feelings, but it's the way in which they do it and who they're sharing to, I probably have an issue with. But anyway, the point I'm getting to is my own experience of it was I had to hit a wall and think everything my life is oriented towards isn't satisfying something deeper within me, something like the soul, you could say. And it's not to say everything is bad in the external world. It's nice to have a good job, a nice girlfriend or wife, whatever else it may well be. Nice to have nice things. But aren't things in and of themselves. And if you look throughout time, the great heroic male figures, they have higher coordinates than just simple worldly things. They're not satisfied with just a hot woman and a flash car or money or looking good online. That's not the hero. And the hero, of course, is the classic archetype of the male. And I do
Hmm.
believe men need something transcendent to aim towards. Now, that heroic path can take many different forms. Of course, the classic in men's work, the king, warrior, magician, lover, and many men are going to be oriented to initiation in those fields. Of course, the classic warrior, maybe he wants to join the army and become some great soldier. Maybe someone wants to exhibit those kingly qualities, almost overcome himself, become sovereign and free. Maybe somebody wants to express themselves artistically. But very often, men aren't getting these paths in this day and age. And I believe this is due to really the deconstruction of what masculinity, but also masculine culture is, which is highly aligned with tradition, arguably religion too. And that's been replaced with political ideology on the one side, so, arguing all day on politics, left and right, all that sort of stuff. But the left has been especially poisonous, in my view, because it's deconstructed masculine meaning and made it seem like it's ethical to do so. And then on the flip side, without that, a lot of men, I think a lot of men I speak to, their fathers grew up with this mentality. It's just about going out and getting things in the world, where I
Yeah, yeah.
started. So in a way, they're lacking these broader senses of meaning which unite them collectively as a people, as a nation, as a religion, as a spirit, as a journey which aids them in transcending themselves, if you will. It's not always about everything being flowery and excellent in the external, but it is about feeling connected on the internal. I could speak a lot about this, but I'm going to leave it there so we can add some extra context and take it in the direction you'd like to go.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so materialism doesn't really satisfy, does it? And that's our culture's based around that. Let's hear a little bit about you personally. Are you a recovering materialist, recovering hedonist, even a recovering leftist? Let's hear a little bit about your personal story.
Yeah, in many senses, I guess you could say I am. Again, I mean, I grew up in a very secular environment, very middle of England, everything very average, as I say. And then I think I just took on the norms of the culture that, like most people do in that era. You know, it was late 90s, early noughts, so Nirvana, Rage Against the Machine. And these things seem, well, they are innocent in a way, but they do imbue you with a certain idea of what the West is. And I think one notable thing for me was, I grew up in Leicester, which is famously very multicultural, or super multicultural, I believe they call it now. But one thing I remember feeling quite keenly growing up was I'm not interesting. I'm plain. You know, he's Jamaican, he's Indian, he's Muslim. Like they have a personality. And I remember growing up thinking that was, yeah, it was like they had flavor in some way. And I didn't. I was plain, boring. Now, of course, I look back on that now and I can see obviously that was the system and very much the ideology of the age. You get that in the woke world. We've seen that for the last 10 years. White people don't have culture and so on. But I was taking on that message very, very early. And I suppose, again, at the time, I didn't, I mean, I had a lot of instincts. When I look back, I do think I had a lot of instincts about this stuff, but I almost, went the opposite way due to a lot of my own pain, if you will, some challenges in my life, parents divorced, couldn't find myself, got mixed up in drugs, these sorts of things, and just thought, well, almost was using a lot of these political models as a vector for my own dissatisfaction and struggles with life in the classic Jordan Petersonian mode. Of course, he spoke about people like that, and I was definitely one of them. So, I felt I was sort of doing everything that I should do to be a moral person in modernity. Went to university, sort of had the right on liberal views, did what most people do at university, read Marxism, think I'm sort of a rebel for doing so.
Mm, mm.
And when I came out of it, I wanted to be a folk singer. I was very into Bob Dylan and people like that. But again, in many ways, I hadn't really found myself with the reality. I was trying to find answers for things. I remember as well, I was really into French existentialism. For those who don't know, they're like serious atheists. You know, the new atheists like Dawkins and Sam Harris. They make very clever arguments, but I've never taken them philosophically seriously. The French existentialists, they were really grappling with the real question of atheism, which is, well, all right, if we're saying there's no God, then we're saying there's no rational cause. And if there's no rational cause, then life is absurd. It's irrational. Now, to me, that's philosophically consistent, and credit to them for going there. You don't get that with the new atheists. But their solution was, in some sense, to embrace a life of almost courage in the face of this absurdity and enjoy life in any way you can. And in a sense, I look back and I was almost treating these people like they were almost saint-like figures in my own life because that's the only people I could find. But long story short, I had to get broken down bit by bit that this just wasn't rooted in anything strong enough for me. And the more that it plagued me, this lack of meaning, this lack of structure, the worldview I was being given, it just didn't make sense anymore. And I think it was probably around my mid-20s, just after I'd done an MA, which was in critical theory. For those who know, that's basically wokeism, before it was wokeism. So I was quite well versed in it, and it was doing that which really showed me this isn't right, like this is mad. And I realized the structure of those left-wing arguments, which I talk a lot about on the channel. It's not the whole of the left, but a massive part of the social justice worldview is this idea that the oppression is taken as read. So white, straight male, that's always bad. Like, that's just always
Right,
the
right.
case. And it's never not the case. And you just have to find a way to argue back to that. And that's how you get the funding. That's how you get the high grades. And really, when you break it down, that's all it is. So I thought, well, look, I can give you a specific example if you want. Actually, I remember having to explore Michel Foucault. And if you don't know Foucault, he's a very famous leftist figure, but he spoke a lot about ideas of the panopticon, which is like a prison where the power structure can see you, but you can't really see it, or you can't see the totality of it. You just see a glimpse of it. And through that prism, if you like, it maintains control. And we had this task of thinking, well, where can we see that today? And you can imagine all the students were like, oh, CCTV, man, and all this stuff. And, well, yeah, all right, CCTV is a bit much. But I remember thinking, the one I can see is political correctness. I mean, that's the one that if everyone will look out for you. It's self-policing because if you say something controversial at university, in your job, or wherever else, the power structure sees you immediately and you'll be reported to it, but you don't see the power structure. I said to one of these lecturers, like, well, what about this? And he was like, no, 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 it doesn't work that way. So it's like you can't turn the lens back on itself. You're not allowed to do that. It's always critique the system, always critique the tradition, always critique the West. And once I realized that, I was like, okay, this isn't as intelligent as they're making out. They use lots of high-minded language, but it's an emotional position more than anything else. Once I started to address my own emotional shortcomings, my own pains in life, came to peace with God in my own way. I wouldn't have called it God back then, but just say, realized my ego had limitations and there was something more to life than me. Then I was like, okay, I can move away from this and found a more spacious, verdant inner space to move into.
Nice. I continuously see an attempt to be good. We need some way to establish virtue. And what's offered in modernity, postmodernity, is some sense of like, well, if you just say the right things, you put the BLM thing up on your Facebook, you say the right phrases, it's not really connected to truth. There isn't really any interest in, I don't know, whether immigrants are a net positive or a net negative, whether they do more crime or less crime. There isn't really an interest in what is true. It's simply a sort of set of beliefs that one espouses for virtue. And in my life, I've increasingly seen that as somewhat shallow. And I think that's been accelerating in our life, right? Like it started with just a bit of political correctness, then it became a bit more militant. Then it frankly went insane with the gender stuff. And I think at that point, any normal person was like, hang on a minute, I just wanted to not be racist. What the hell have I signed? I didn't sign up for this. And now it seems like there's a sea change. So maybe you could just say something about that journey that we've been witness to in not just our personal lives, but in the wider society of Britain and the world at large.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, you're touching on obviously probably the biggest issue in politics and cultural politics for the past 10, 15, 20 years. But I think the roots of it do go a lot deeper. I do think a lot of the online right, I think rightly so, have been speaking about this post-Second World War consensus, the liberal consensus. And of course, the reason why you're not allowed to talk about this, as you can imagine in this day and age, is if you question it, you're immediately Hitler, you're immediately a Nazi, you're immediately evil. But there are some really important things to address there, which are the presuppositions which have led us to this place. And again, this is where you get these ideas where this idea, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's true, it's that it's controversial that it matters and you seem like you're morally wrong. And this is just across every case now. The grooming gangs exploded again recently. It's always the same. It's like it's not about what's actually happening. It's about the structure of you're seen as morally superior if you take the role of denying what's perceived to be your own group, because that shows you can get out of your own ego and leftist thought and acknowledge the other in their own thinking. That makes you good and virtuous. So you must always hold to that in every single situation. And if you like, that became that almost got branched on or grafted on to the post-Second World War ideology, where you now get these ideas, and you do see it tacitly happening now when, Victory in Europe Day comes around or whatever. And there is this attempt in places like the BBC to almost imply that what Churchill was doing was, destroying the bigot Nazi Hitler in order to welcome the multicultural utopia that is the modern Western world. Of course, it's completely ahistorical, but in a way, it's retelling the mythology or recreating a mythology of the past to suit the wants of the present liberal regime, which is dominant. So I think that's the first thing which has led to this madness that's going on. And now more and more people are realizing this just doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make any sense, again, because as I said at the top, in my belief, we're deeper than our minds. We have very, very, very deep structures as human beings, ties, I believe, to God, ties to our ancestors, ties to culture, things that really have worked over centuries. And when you start hacking away at those things, eventually someone goes, ouch, you're whacking on something very deep inside of me. And they haven't got the language to explain it yet. But increasingly people are finding that language. I think that's why there's a re-interest in Christianity and so on nowadays, because people are looking for the roots to find out, why does it bother me that Christianity is collapsing? Why does it bother me that we don't have our own tradition, that Islam is ascendant? It shouldn't in the liberal mindset, but people are learning more and more. Well, there's something in there that's theirs. There's some heritage in there that's been lost, and they're almost searching for it. Tragically, they go to a church and, it's a
Right.
lesbian bishop reading out the Guardian, but that's a conversation for another time. The issue is they're searching for something deep and they're not finding it 90% of the time in the church, but it is there. That's the important thing. And I think the second thing, which is perhaps more controversial with all this, is, I mean, I think people like Ed Dutton speak a lot about this, but there's something to do with the feminization of our politics and the increasing feminine voice. And females tend to, not always, but tend to, as a group, aim more towards consensus and groupthink and group-based morality. And again, this is the stuff of evolutionary psychology, which isn't exactly my field, but I do think these guys are right when they're saying that, like, a lot of this is, it's not about being right, it's about being seen as being wrong by the group. And this is again political correctness 101. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily that you've done anything wrong some of the time, it's that you're seen to have done something wrong. So everybody holds the line, and it becomes this mad competition of who can be more right on. And again, it's created this completely suffocating environment that many of us are living in today. And many people now, even the normies, are rebelling against.
Yeah, it does seem like the game is up somehow. Even in the last year or two, there's been a change. I mean, I agree with you, sort of liberalism is in some ways a boundary issue, right? In some ways, it's a lack of boundaries that led. This is why Trump's wall, I think, was so symbolic because of course, there's nothing weird about a wall. As countries have barriers and borders, but any kind of barrier and border has been seen as in some way problematic. Barriers to do with you're a man or a woman, barriers to do with behavior, gender behavior, sexual behavior, national boundaries. That in some ways is a sort of barrierlessness or a boundarylessness of the sort of overly yin, overly feminine. And that just leads to craziness and all sorts of other practical problems, which are now getting so extreme, like the grooming gangs, for example, that it's just hard for people to deny at this point.
Well, I think that's exactly it. And I think also it's a difficult thing again, because this is why I speak so much about tradition and these energies, because it's almost like what the West is yearning for is the return of that fatherly energy, not this toxic father we've been told about by the leftists for 20 years, who's this draconian bully, but the wise father who can implement those solid boundaries. And as you say, rightly or wrongly, Trump was symbolic of that via things like let's build a wall. It's very direct language, it's talking to boundaries. But you can see at the moment, and I think you probably have a few things to say on this as well, because it's a mutual area of interest, but you see this with the men who are really struggling. Lots of mental health issues with men, lots of addictions, a lot of them feeling like their lives are meaningless. Well, what advice are they given by the mainstream? It's the
Hmm.
same. Go and talk more. Go and share your feelings more. Be a woman more. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with sharing your feelings, but I believe if you just say to men, go and share your feelings like it's a knitting circle with women, it's not going to help them in the long run. It might
Right.
help in the beginning. It might help them be like, do you know what? I've been carrying this load, this weight, and it's really nice to get it off my chest. But what men really need, what I've seen men really welcome, is that journey of growth and challenge and action and seeing themselves make progress in the world. That's what they yearn for. So yeah, there can be space for this talk about your feelings stuff, but it has to be aligned. I mean, I like to call it the line between empathy and action. By all means, I'm up for
Hmm.
empathy, but then we need to take action. We can't just sit around being poor me all day. Yeah, if you've been through some rough times, all right, you're going to need a few months to bottom out and need a bit of love. That's fine. But once that's done, let's get going. You're not meant to just sit there wallowing, talking about your feelings all the time. And I think it makes men ill when they do that. This is why I'm very, very wary of modern psychology and therapy. Not because I think it's completely bad, I think it can be really useful, but when it's utilized correctly. Because again, it's what so many of us do is just go into these modalities where we're just in our head all the time, thinking, lost in our emotions. A lot of the time, what men have got to do is work through and get over and transcend. That's classically masculine, spiritually speaking, rather than stay in this place where they're stewing, if you will. So again, I think that this is another major problem in our culture about, well, how do we bring that energy back in that allows men to be initiated into what they truly are, to evolve into what they truly are? And again, I mean, this is something that I spoke about on the channel recently, which I do really love satire, and I'm English, of course I do. But it seems to me that's almost like the highest mode at the moment is the comedian, that who will cut someone down. And there is a divine part of that. Like you should cut people down who are getting too big for their boots. But I think men also need that path to really grow into something meaningful. And by all means, we need to shred the bullshit. And comedy, satire is a good tool for doing that. But we also need that figure, that in biblical language can reflect from the mountain and be someone that guides us. And we can look to and be like, yeah, cool. This is a path of actual growth and meaning for me that engages men in their lives, their communities, their societies. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, men don't just need to talk about their bad lives. They need better lives. They need meaning. They need purpose. They need community, and as well as the economic stuff. It's multi factors: the tech, the disembodiment. I talk about. There's a whole bunch of factors there, but simply whining about it isn't the case. Isn't helpful, and it just doesn't seem like boys are offered a positive view of what it is to be a man. So on the one hand, the mainstream media basically just says be less manly. And on the other side, you've got the sort of hyper toxic Andrew Tates of the world who are offering a very materialistic vision of sort of masculine. It's almost like a boy who has no dad's version of masculinity in this highly materialistic frame. So where can boys get some sense of what it is to be a man?
Well, that's the big question. That's the big question that I think people like me are landing on. And I think I really believe that at the root of things, there is a wisdom in culture itself, and you have to wake up to that wisdom. You almost have to dig, and it will guide you. Once you're open, your heart's open, you're clear, you're aligned with tradition, it will guide you to the truth. And the harsh reality is that there isn't anything at the moment. That's why we're suffering. There is no wise father because it's been removed, it's been destroyed. It's a bit going right back to Nietzsche, God is dead and we've killed him. And how are we now going to build our moral structures without that? That's never really been answered. And you even see it within Christianity, which arguably is sort of the core of the Western tradition. Well, that's battled over now all the time. It's tried to be pulled over and worn as a skin suit by liberalism and so on. But what I believe needs to happen needs to be this sort of collective reawakening amongst the men of the West now. I personally have looked around everywhere, and there are some amazing people out there. There really are. Some really cool people in the Orthodox Church, some Catholics that are doing some interesting stuff, even some of the pagan guys who are doing some interesting stuff. But they're all trying to search and reawaken this soul energy to try and let it shine for the men. And I would honestly say the best way we can source meaning in that guidance is to become part of that journey because everyone is needed. We need as many men as we possibly can talking about these things, learning about them, becoming the sort of guys that can be versed in what a lot of our heritage, symbology, spirituality, masculine initiatory journeys mean so they can help their brothers, which of course in turn will help themselves. Once we start helping the other, we are
Mm.
gifted. I do believe that's sort of a divine, universal rule. We are gifted with growth of our own. So, unfortunately, there aren't that many folks out there. I mean, God, I've looked in the church, believe me, and I've just been left wanting. Doesn't mean everyone in there's bad, but it's why folks like me, again, gravitate almost away from the core of their own historic traditions, i.e., Anglicanism. I do go to an Anglo-Catholic church quite a lot, but broadly, most of the time I'm looking at orthodoxy and going to Orthodox churches and chatting to Orthodox people. But these are sort of Eastern European, really. When you look at their structures, they're like rock core churches, Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, and so on. And again, it's like people are almost having to go there because that's where the masculine essence will be allowed. So the point I'm making is, yeah, it's a real mess, but we all have to start digging and be part of the journey. And the truth is there, and in that sense, it's a challenging but exciting time as well. And I pray that I'm wrong. I pray for 100 elders to come along and be like, shut up, Richard. We don't need you anymore. I'd be like,
Yeah,
thank you,
thanks.
take it.
Appreciate it. Appreciate I don't want
Yeah,
this
I
job.
appreciate
What
it.
do you this?
Exactly, exactly. I don't know. I'm not some wise master. I'm figuring this stuff out myself as some lost kid who bangs into the wall like so many youngsters these days when they're growing up. I was lucky to survive and find the way. But the problem is when you start looking, you just get another lecture from a Guardian Easter, or some old boy who's a lovely fella, but his Christianity's cucumber sandwiches and gentleness and all that sort of thing.
Well, the
And
Anglican Church is gone. I mean, there was
well, right, right.
the beautiful like 800-year-old church in the little town I used to live in, and I walked in. This is a beautiful place, and the first thing I saw was like a flyer at the front that had some rainbow on and saying everyone's welcome. And then the new vicar introduced themselves, and they were, let's say, gender confused. And there's all these little old ladies just going, "Oh my God, what are we doing?" I just felt really sorry for them. They'd been going there for 30 or 40 years. And there's a beautiful building, but I had no sense there was it's essentially there's no tradition there. It was simply sold out to the absolute worst of the modern culture. Though I do have hope when I look at young people now, because while I see the sort of the doomers, I see the people who are depressed and they're mentally ill and addicted and vaping, I see the doomers. I also see some really virile young guys who are working out, who are seeking, they're going to whether it's Catholicism or Orthodoxy, or they're looking into traditions, and they don't the mainstream culture doesn't offer them much. It says you're bad simply for existing. You're a white male, so therefore you're bad. They're actively discriminated against in the workplace. They're mocked. Every sort of TV show out there just mocks them, ridicules them. If they have any sort of sensible view, they're called sort of far right inverted commas, which I think now is starting to lose its power. It's starting to look a bit silly at this point. That I think it was recently the British government classified anyone who believed in any kind of had any kind of skepticism towards mass migration as far right and potentially a criminal. But I think it's something's falling apart. It seems like the regime, the mono party, because the Conservatives and Labour in the UK and everywhere else, I spoke to someone in Portugal yesterday and they said, Mark, I don't want to, they were sort of saying in their Portuguese voice, I don't want to seem extreme right, but I'm very worried about the huge number of Pakistani people who have moved to Portugal in the last 2 years, and crime has gone up, and someone followed me down the street and I didn't feel safe as a woman. And I was like, yeah, okay, welcome to Britain's reality. It does seem to be, if not global, then certainly across Europe. But I also have this sense of hope because I see young guys with very little to gain from the regime who are pissed off.
Well, I mean, again, I think you touched on several important things there. I mean, first of all, I sort of mentioned it briefly earlier, and I'm really eager to mention this on the channel as much as I can. I think what you're touching on is what I often refer to as the non-rational. And again, in liberal modernity, everything's hyper rational. It's a sort of Louis Theroux worldview, and it's very sweet and it's lovely, but everything's so reasonable. And it's fine on the surface, but once you start breaking it down, you do realize there is a deeply non-rational part to the human being. And by non-rational, I don't mean, mindless, wild emotionality. That's what we sort of think when someone says non-rational. I mean things like heritage, spirit, blood, community, love. These are all things which they're not rational. They're not part of the intellect ordering. They're almost deeper and more powerful influences. And this is exactly what the traditional world would bring together, try and harmonize. And exactly what modernity doesn't. It sort of ignores these things. I mean, you think, what is love in modernity, really? I
Right.
mean, it's Hollywood, isn't it? It's like, Stacey, you're my life. And it's like, well, that's not really love. That's just lusting after someone and cheap romance. And a lot of people inherit this idea and then they try and find that in the world or in a woman, and they think, well, I thought I was in love with this woman, but now it's turned to crap, or I can't live without her. You get this one, it's in all the music as well. And you think, well, if you think you can't live without her, yeah, there's an element of a natural human response there, but you're making her your God because you don't understand what love is. And I said this in a video a while back, if you look at a lot of the pop songs today and then compare them with poetry about God 1,000 years ago, they're oddly similar. Like, you're my life, you're the flame that completes me, the light
It's a
in my
lot to put
sky.
on a poor girl, isn't it?
Exactly.
Romance has got to do the heavy lifting of religion. Like that's a hell of a weight to put on your relationship, man. That you have to be
Exactly.
everything. Yeah,
Exactly. And you
it's
just see this disordering of the deeper natures of who and what we are. And, so many of us are so closed off to this. We don't know how to handle and manage these very delicate and profound parts of ourselves. So they're just almost funneled into the narrowness of modernity, and it leads to lots of pain down the line. And of course, love's just one example. There are many, like I said. But I think as modernity gets further and further in, and more corrosive. Like I said, it strikes people very deeply in a way that they can't quite articulate sometimes, because what it's doing is touching the essence of who you are. Now, in one sense, that's really sad because it's going that far and breaking people down that much. But in another sense, it's a real sign of hope because it's showing that they're getting to the core of what someone is. And
Mm.
now that's a waking up. And when that wakes up, it's going to push back against the liberal power structure, which I believe is a very dark power structure of the age. Now, when it comes to liberalism itself, and if you like, what it's doing on the surface level, again, we have to understand that it's like I said at the beginning, that structure of I'm moral if I accept the other, quote unquote, that is the core, almost semi pseudo religious ideology of the liberal, and it's
That
so
that plus we're all the same, right? That doesn't
we're
matter
all
where
the same.
people are
Yeah.
from. That
Yeah.
it's someone can come from any country to London and they sort of magically become British. It's a
Exactly.
strange idea, isn't it? There's no such thing as genetics. There's no spiritual connection between people and place. And I know
Yeah.
for some listeners it may be almost confusing to hear this because most people's dichotomy is between a sort of left, the sort of fluffy and nice, like we're the nice people, we help people, we believe in, maternity leave and weekends. And then the right, which is the sort of like evil capitalists, and they're the ones who are nasty on the right, and there's particularly sort of women and the youth position themselves more on the left. But you're almost like a hippie fascist, right? Like not literally a fascist. I'm joking with the sort of connection there, but this idea of being a traditionalist of deep spirituality, that doesn't have to come along with intersectional Marxism, right?
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, no, exactly. And hippie fascist is a good term. Yeah, this is like a joke term. Yeah, that it's getting some purchase. But the the thing that I think you're talking to is the propaganda of the liberal mainstream. And like all things in life, it's not that it's a complete lie. Like there's a broad truth to compassion is high on the left. There's a broad truth to the idea that they want to care for the poor and the despondent and those who've been abused, and that's of course a noble thing. There's a Christ-like quality to that, but they apply that model to everything they think and almost say that anyone who's outside of that is immediately bad. And that's the problem. And again, that's the structure where modern leftism got so toxic. And I think why it's pushed so many people away is because more and more people are waking up. Again, classic example is the grooming gangs, which has happened recently. Let's just deny it's happening, pretend it's not going on for decades, call anyone who calls it out a far right evil bigot. And then eventually they've got to a point where they just can't deny it anymore because they're
Correct.
losing the country. And so many people are waking up. And then they realize, oh, you're not these lovely, compassionate people who were concerned about Muslims. Why they're really doing it is because they think they're better than you. They want to hold on to their psycho-cultural understanding of who they are. I'm the good leftist who fights against the injustice of the world. There's no difference between them and the diversity and inclusion person who comes into the corporate world who gets paid 100 grand to survey, do an audit. Is that person really going to say, yeah, everything's fine here? No, they're not, because their whole moral system that they survive on as an individual is rooted in the idea that I'm good, I'm going to point the finger at you, and I'm going to be this sort of holier than thou figure. But none of it's really real. So
And what,
again,
go
sorry,
on.
go on.
What drives this, do you think? So, I mean, is it just a sort of compassion gone wrong? Is it something far darker than that? The Christian part of me kind of looks at some of the ways it's going, and it just looks demonic. Other people say, particular groups are behind it. And I think there's certainly a good argument that a lot of it's just money, right? Like my friend in Portugal I spoke to yesterday, she was saying on the news in Portugal was being told, oh, we need mass migration for the economy. And it's essentially cheap labor that brings the wages down. Of course, the sort of factory owners in Portugal love the fact that there's cheap labor. Almost like when I see like the Deliveroo drivers, it's almost like a sort of slave caste who barely have any ability to better themselves, who maybe don't speak the local language, you can't unionize. There's also a sort of strong economic driver to a lot of what we see, that we're all just fungible units that be moved around by global capitalism. How do we bring together the sort of traditionalist view of looking at the world in terms of soul and people and land with a skeptical analysis of money?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer to that is money is the essence of materialism, which goes right back to Christ, you know. And I think the this is very difficult not for the average person on the right, because again, they've been funneled into a very narrow-minded view of the right. And, you know, I've said this before, but when I was in London and exploring some more right-wing ideas, probably wasn't even right wing, but still, I was exploring them. And this girl I was seeing told one of her friends this, and her partner was one of the socialist trendy lefties in London. And I met him, and he wanted me to explain Thatcher to him, like how you could justify that. Now, in a way, you kind of feel sorry for him because this is like he just so funneled into a very narrow way of viewing the world. I lean right, quote unquote, if I'm to go by the traditional political spectrum, but I don't really believe in that anyway. But the point I'm making is we have this understanding of the right as kind of market, you know, and private property and mild law and order, small c conservatism. I think what I'm talking to a lot on the channel is something a bit more profound than that, which is
Yeah.
more the sacred aspect, which is imbued through the tradition. So sacred order, which will go right back to the French Revolution, because that's really what it was kicking against, the idea of sacred order, hierarchy, tradition.
Right, right. I had a friend say, "Oh, you're like a 1980s Thatcherite." I'm like, "No, no, no. I'm more like a 16th century. Like I'm like you're way off with the sort of year, and even before that, even like 3000 BC traditionalist. You know, it's a very different year that we're orientating to."
Well, that's exactly it. And it's how again, I certainly am not a Thatcherite, but it's how the right's been co-opted in the service of the globalist system itself. So again, core theme on the channel I speak a lot about is this idea of the real, well, it's not the ultimate power structure, but the major power structure in modernity is this economic, let's just say, capital-based system, which wants open borders. It wants to flow capital and people over borders easily, and for many reasons. Number one, they don't like the nation state, or at least the nation, perhaps more correctly, because the nation represents an actual people, a collective that can stand up and oppose its power. So if you disseminate your own ideology through that given nation, import mass numbers of people, what you'll find is that that nation is no longer nearly as coherent. And we've seen this in the last 40 years in Britain. For instance, look at the arguments in the 80s, Thatcherite economics on the right and the socialist miners. Well, big disagreements in economics, but what about culture? They weren't that far apart. If
Right.
you ask both sides, do you love Britain? They both say yes. Now, they might love it for different reasons, but they love Britain. That's what we've lost. Now it's split much more on cultural lines. Economics is a secondary consideration for most. So this is what's happened. The right has been sold out by making it purely material, removing the sacred aspect, and the left has been sold out by basically wokeifying it. And again, all these wokies think they're rebelling against the system, but they're actually in service of it. That was made clear to me in my time in London years ago. I walked out of the office one day after work. These anarchists, quote unquote, were marching down the road against Brexit. But I remember that day reading that Barclays and HSBC and State Street and all the rest of them in Canary Wharf were like, we can't do Brexit. So the anarchists and the bankers are on the same
Oh,
team.
absolutely. You're right. Like if Barclays is waving your flag, then you're not an anarchist, that's for sure. But I mean, it's also like the mono party, right? Like whoever we've had in the UK over the last 20 years has had more or less the same policies. You know, migration increased most under the Conservatives. And then it's like, okay, now it looks like reform might get a chance, but they seem to be swinging back to the mono party point of view. It's like no one's allowed. It's like you can vote for whoever you want as long as they have the same opinions. As the Chinese saying, right? Like, like I think it actually goes back to the ancient Greeks, which is you can vote for whoever you want as long as I pick the candidates.
Yeah. Well, this is coming to the core ideas that, some of the big brain intellectuals on the right talk about the managerial state, which again, I think is a very, very good insight. But the idea that really the liberal power structure dominates, well, the world, I think now, other than China. But the general idea is that our leaders aren't really leaders; they're just managers. And when you look at them, you sort of see what they mean. I mean, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, do these people believe in anything?
Right, right.
Are
What would
they
they die?
actual
What would they
leaders?
stand for, let alone die for?
Well,
You know,
exactly,
I was
exactly.
I was teaching in Belgium this year, and I said, "Who here would die for Belgium?" And people laughed out loud. And I
Yeah.
said, "Well, you do know in World War One, the Belgian king actually was in the trenches fighting. It was only what's that, 110 years ago." That was literally leaders were prepared to die for their nation, and now I see like most nations are sort of zombie nations. They're walking dead nations. They pretend to be nations, but they're really just sort of economic zones for some sort of global economic system, pretending to be countries.
Well, exactly. And this is again is tying everything we've been speaking about together. It's why the mass immigration is happening. It dilutes the tradition and the people of a given nation. You can hammer anyone who's against it as a racist. That plays into the groupthink. And then the managerial class who we're ruled by. And again, if you have anyone who is original, who really does want to say things that he believes in, they'll be wiped out of the system easily. So we're ruled essentially by these distant elites who have no affinity with us, who are there because they'll essentially do what the liberal regime behind them wants them to do. And it's like you say, whether it's Labour or Tory, effectively we get the same thing. Mass migration increases, and on top of that, really the core is they don't want to impact anything to do with the smooth flow of business going through Canary Wharf, but also the City of London. And this is why, again, we see this all the time. You mentioned it earlier with your friend in Portugal. They're being told, well, we need the workers so we can basically, keep the economy afloat. Why is the economy always the be all and end all of everything?
Right,
I
right.
understand it's incredibly important. I'm not trying to be naive here. I know you need to keep an economy afloat, but to the point of losing your country, like, is it that important? And this, we've never been given the choice. Look, would you rather be a bit poorer and maintain the integrity of your nation? Or do you constantly want to chase this line go up politics, which for the average person isn't improving their quality of life? Because again, I mean, how many people can afford a house in London now, or even in the
Right.
UK now? So how are they really gaining anyway? So again, I think more and more people are starting to think, well, what is going on? And to bring things full circle, this is why the Labour Party in the UK right now are just granting concessions everywhere on immigration, on the grooming gangs, on and on it goes, because they can see that they've been checkmated and they're trying to reverse it all so they can, fool you into thinking that they're on your side. But why they're doing that is so ultimately they can just continue the globalist program.
Right, and it will continue, and it's very easy to get disheartened. Let's maybe talk a little about how to stay sane. If I turn on my YouTube and your videos I like a lot because they're calm. It's not like angry, shouty guy. My girlfriend was, oh, you got that nice man on again. And she's not listening to what you're saying, but she just the vibe's nice, right? But a lot of what's on YouTube around this content is either cynical, like you said, the sort of slightly evil Joker figure, or it's plain rageful. And it's really easy. It's really hard, excuse me, to not kind of either get despairing or rageful in the face of this sort of endless tide of gaslighting and just utter bullshit that we're being fed on a daily basis. So how do we keep sane and well in the face of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was touching on this on a video this morning actually, but this is something that I think again is part of what I believe needs to happen and is going to happen eventually is a sort of rebirth where I think that is cultural. I think it will be to do with the whole of the Western world because this is the depth of the problem, but it also is personal. It's a personal shift. And I know the pain of it all. I mean, again, in my time in London 7 years ago, something like that, I think I had about 3 months where I was mourning for Britain, and really understanding it's gone and it's dying and it can't be reversed. And it's very, very hard. But I'm glad I went through it because after I went through it, I did feel free and the news stopped hurting me so much. I stopped being so affected by it and getting so angry. And I think I'm not saying this that means, oh, just give up England, then give up Britain. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we have to accept the reality of the situation, go through that mourning process like you would for a beloved old friend. But on the other side of it, I learned a really valuable lesson, which is a lot of the time when you're being made emotional, you're being manipulated by someone. And
Mhm.
number two, when I'm in emotional state myself, I'm very often moving into my ego, my mind narrows, I don't make sense of things as well. You can easily get caught out. On and on it goes. There are all manner of personal maladies that can happen when one loses their cool. And of course, this directly relates to the Christian tradition as well. We're not told to be kind of lost in our emotions and lost in the drama of the world. We're taught to be in the world, but not of it. And I think this has been very, very key in helping me understand the world and bear it. But also, almost when the world gets worse, it almost imbues you with a sense of peace and strength because you're moving back into your foundations and the tradition. And this is a really key thing, which I'm really eager to impress on people if I can, if they're willing to accept it, which is, let's just say everything, that people are concerned about was reversed. The women stopped being so hoary, the men stopped being so hoary too, and decided to go back to tradition and families. Mass immigration, we had deportations, and finally we had sensible numbers here, and those people could integrate, but the core of the country was the ancient inheritors of Britain, and we could have our tradition, and the economy stabilized, and we all had all of that. Well, that's great. But would we be able to bear that world in the state that we're presently in? That's
Mhm.
the big question. Like, if everything happened for us, are we in the state to do that?
Right.
And this is the big one. And this really splits the men from the boys, in my view, because there are some people out there that unfortunately do just want to shout. They want to shout
Mm.
on camera, and other people want to shout back on their screen and type all this angry stuff. And if you want to do that, cool, cool, knock yourself out. But I don't really want to be part of that because I don't think it's a solution and I don't think it really helps people. I think there's an opportunity in there for us to think, well, okay, how do we evolve ourselves? How do we become worthy, if you like, of maintaining and carrying on this tradition? Because what a wonderful inheritance for you. What a wonderful, incredible inheritance for you. And don't worry about how you'll do it, because again, everything around you is being corroded, so it's going to reveal your own roots. So this is why I'm more eager to express this sense of calm and hopefully this sense that you can actually enjoy your life a little bit. Because if you've got all this tension and stress, you're going to be full of all sorts of illnesses and all sorts of demonic forces are going to start to corrupt you. But if you can get out in the country, enjoy the beauty of nature and so on, it will do wonders for your physical and mental system. But also, if you need to reframe all this in your mind, yeah, this is corrosive. But like in my personal life and like a gazillion other people out there, very often you have to hit the hard times before you can recover. And it's the same with us as a country, and I believe the West in general. We have to now just basically see ourselves go through a death so we can have a rebirth. And yeah, it will be rocky, it will be messy, but to me, that seems like the best way forward.
Yeah, yeah, we're definitely on the way to hitting rock bottom, as they'd say in alcohol recovery. And then that's it's like we've woken up with one too many hangovers, and it's like, okay, time for a change. Let's get really practical, right? So a lot of people who follow my channel are young guys. I think it's like 25 to 35 is the biggest kind of listener base, which is fantastic. It's really, really great to see them tuning in, and really always intelligent questions in the comments. Let's give them some sort of practical stuff to work with here. If they want to embrace tradition, if they want a more wholesome life, they can't go back to the 1950s. Their mind is different than people in the 1950s. They've been on their iPhones and probably porn since they were young. There's all sorts of differences they have in their mentality, but they're like, hey, I want to be positive here. You've mentioned being outside, getting out in nature. I do that every single day. I pop into church every single day. I go to the gym most days. What are your like top things they should be doing for their own sanity, if not to make a bigger contribution?
Yeah, good question. I think the first thing is just touching or leading on from what I ended on last time, which is you got to start by reframing things. You can't buy into this media and this line that everything's hopeless and screw everything, because that's only going to feed into just this doom mindset of screw it all. And, I've had friends reach out to me personally, and one or two of them do what's called riding the decline. They just go to London, earn as much money as they can, bang as many women as they can, get drunk, take drugs, enjoy life because there's no saving it. Now, I've said to them, and look, I'm not going to be like, don't you do that. It's not my role to do that. It's their own father's role. But I have said to them, like, look, if your soul starts screaming to you, I'm here. And their soul always starts screaming to them after a while. I mean, like most men, many men listening, I'm sure you've enjoyed the hookup world. Yeah, it's fun for a while, but it runs out. And then you start realizing, yeah, this is just corrosive and meaningless. So the first thing is to recognize that yes, you are greatly challenged. We are greatly challenged. But with great challenge comes great capacity for growth. And we are not from the stock of people who just sat there and said things are bad. You know, there are wonderful people in our spiritual, national, cultural, ethnic traditions who have overcome incredible hardships. In fact, who've been made by those hardships. So we shouldn't be looking at the world being full of despair and hopeless. We should be looking at it thinking, I am being called to something here. And you might not know what it is, and it's all right to not know what it is. In fact, it's probably essential to not know what it is. You need to be lost in order to be found. But the first thing I'm saying is, look, we have to change how we view all of this. And think, yeah, it's bad. But with this comes massive opportunity for growth, evolution that's beyond what we've learned before. This brings us to the tradition because this is the best thing to guide you. There are wonderful characters out there in the churches and so on, but they are few and far between. That's just a tragic reality. And a lot of them are still liberal boomers. They have that worldview. And some of them, on top of that, are woke. So you're unfortunately not going to get much help from the church. I wouldn't say that means don't go. I would go because number one, it's important to learn your traditions. And number two, you might still meet, a like-minded young fella there, or there might be a really good preacher there. You do get these things. But the broader point I'm making is we have to start doing our reading and finding where do we feel that real juicy spiritual truth, masculine truth. Where are you finding it? And I would start digging and looking around and really embracing that journey, whether it's traditional orthodoxy, the church fathers, whether it's even figures outside of Christianity, if that's not your thing, but just finding who are these figures back in time who, if you like, blended that path of spiritual learning with masculine capacity. Bushido in Japan is a good example, the Shaolin monk. If these things inspire you, explore them. I wouldn't have hard rules on it if you're just starting out, but learn about what these paths are, learn about what these paths of discipline are. And again, I wouldn't force discipline on yourself. One of the most helpful teachings I got when I was learning some of this stuff was you need devotion, not discipline. Because discipline can be too bub, 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 bub. Discipline works for a while, but you'll get tired of it, you know? Devotion is discipline mixed with love, and that's perfect because you
Right,
need to be
right.
drawn, you need to be serving something that you love. And if you don't know what it is, you just love finding out what the truth is. Love life itself. Take a step out of all of the mess of modernity and look into the majesty of the universe, the majesty of your body, the majesty of whatever it is that you're trying to create. There are so many beautiful things in this life, and it's always been this way. Like the life in the world has always been messy. This is a theme throughout the Bible. The real life is within, in the spirit. And once you go into that, you can re-enter the world through a lens of love. Don't worry about that fancy stuff for now. Just follow where your heart takes you. In terms of practicalities, once you're finding that, I would then start to, when you're ready, don't force yourself, but when you're ready, start to follow the dictates of the tradition that you choose. And start slow if you need to start slow. So again, a bit like you, Mark, I tend to revolve around a Christian life, especially a mystic Christian life. So it's time for contemplation, time to listen to the birds in nature, time to check in what's going on in my body, time to read scripture, time to connect with brothers who are on the same path, check in pride, envy, lust, all of these poisons that if they're not checked in, can really corrupt me from the inside. Is there any of my thinking that's going into resentment or hatred? These sorts of things are real. And although it's a cliche, the right are full of hatred, I work really hard not to be rooted in hatred. I don't want to hate anybody. It will poison me in the long run. So when you're ready to accept that tradition that you choose, you'll be gifted with, mountains of things that you can do to contain, as it's called, yourself. And like the butterfly, you have to go through that phase of containment to come out the other end evolved. Hopefully, there's some practical ones to start.
Yeah. like it. Like it's funny, the sort of hate thing, isn't it? It's like what's now called hate speech in UK law is can be some of the most, rooted in some of the most loving heartfeltness, the loving right or the loving tradition. Like that is a key thing here. So we're not getting caught in viciousness or just some of the nastiness that could come as a backlash, right?
Well, that's exactly it. And this is why I often talk about the wise father. That's what the wise father is, or God the Father in Christian language, wise father in sort of archetypal language. But that's an energy that, can course through you. And I believe that's the energy that has the maturity and the poise to see us through. You mentioned it earlier with Andrew Tate, who, in many ways, look, Tate is a response to the excess leftism that's dominated the society. If we had more of a patriarchal, wise father energy, there would be no Tate. That's the irony of it all.
Well, he only gets away with it because he says one thing that's true that you're not allowed to say, or that no one else is saying, or you've been gaslit isn't the case, and then he can back that with the next thing, which isn't true, right? Because like the only reason he's got any ammunition, is because of that. But as we're talking about sort of famous figures, what about Jordan Peterson? What's your sense of his rise and perhaps now decline?
Yeah, I mean, I was a really big fan of him when he came out. I probably had started my own learning on this stuff a couple of years before. And when he came out, he was definitely hitting a lot of the things that I'd learned and deepening those, to be fair, as well. So I think he did a really, really valuable service. I think on a sort of universal energy level, he was symbolic of an embryonic masculine reawakening, and perhaps also making an argument outside of, again, the core of liberal modernity. I think if I was to be hypercritical, which is a bit mean, but let's just go there because he's such a big figure and so influential. I think it's probably fair to. He, while he's opened up so many men to the value of tradition and religion and symbology, which is in essence opening up to their soul, really, it does seem to me that he is himself very intellectual and he's still
Yes.
almost part of modernity. And I have watched him before and he's like just grappling with these ideas, like, I can't work it out and all this. And I think, oh man, Jordan, like you're 10 times the intellect I will ever be, but you can't, a lot of this you can't work out. There's a point where the mind can go no further. And again, this is the non-rational I speak about, where we have to almost hold our hands open and fall into the arms of God in religious language, or if like don't like that, just the death of the ego, I suppose, in more New Age language. But the problem there is, again, it's just Christianity then just becomes another argument in a field of arguments
Hmm.
rather than, and Christianity's always had that tradition, especially in Catholicism, a very strong intellectual tradition. But that's not the sum total of it, it's a dimension of it. So that would be problem number one. And number two, I mean, I think it's he became too politicized, and that's always going to be risky for anyone, myself included. But the problem there is that he essentially has become a neocon. I think he started to stand for a sort of libertarianism, which is just one or two steps behind the liberalism which has corroded the West anyway. So I don't think, when you really dig down to it, I'm not sure it's that long of a solution. It's that much of a solution, sorry. And again, I think the real issues of the age are deeper than he's willing to speak about. Things such as, yes, there is an ethnic element to it. I mean, it's the total element of it. There is a spiritual element to it. That's also true. But also, there are arguments around who he's siding with on the international stage. And I think that's probably a controversial one, but
Hmm.
I can see people's concerns there. It does seem excessive when you say to one group, no, that's evil, but this group over here, yes, yes, yes. And you need to have an identity.
Yeah, yeah, there's some paymasters there, and someone maybe we can be grateful for making a function in time. There's a lot of boys who were almost raised by him, and yeah, maybe it's time to move beyond that. I'd also be kind of curious, like, what's he not saying? What topics won't he touch with a barge pole? When does it start to seem sort of like containment rather than the actual lead edge? Certainly to me, he doesn't seem like the sort of lead edge of the thought that's going against some of the really toxic things in the culture at this point. But yeah, someone to be respected and someone who's done a lot of great work too. So maybe we can be nuanced in that.
Yeah, agreed. Agree.
Mm. Let's talk a little bit about dating. I think we've both made mistakes in this area. We've gone through suddenly I'll speak for myself. I've gone through a horror stage in the past, and I'm thinking about making a video called "How Not to Sleep with 500 Women." And I've got a lot more conservative in my middle age, and I've come to the conclusion that sex isn't just a materialistic toy to play with, that you're always playing with fire, and there's real harm that can be done. And yeah, and I also despair when I look at the sort of OnlyFans culture, when I look at some of the sort of dating culture, and I know there's some young guys listening to this going, "Hey, I just want a girlfriend, and I can't even get a match on Tinder." So it seems like the whole dating market, to use a slightly gross phrase, has been totally destroyed as well. But yeah, what's your input for young guys on how to date it wisely?
Well, yeah, another really big area. I mean, this is one that I've personally experienced as well. The first thing to say is, again, this comes back to the ethos of the age. Everything's become about the material. Everything's become about freedom, which is basically licentiousness. It's not real freedom. And because we're in this age where we've removed the sacred, there's no higher order. So everything comes down to immediate worldly pleasure. And that's what everybody chases and thinks will satisfy them. But as always, it's fool's gold. So it will satisfy you for a while, but not for the long run. And it will corrode your society and you while you're waiting. But when it comes to the actual dating market in this day and age, first thing to be said is yes, it's bad. Yes, it's really bad. But I wouldn't say there's no hope, and I wouldn't get into that mindset that there's no hope
Mm,
because,
mhm.
the first thing that I could say is that I did engage in the red pill. I did engage in pickup. I read lots of books about it. I practiced it a lot in London. I was pretty clueless when I started. By the time I ended, I was a bit of a dab hand. But I learned some really valuable things in it. While I wouldn't promote it,
Right.
I think one of the reasons why I found it so intoxicating was, of course, the women, which is a bit like a drug, but also because I was learning about masculine and feminine energy,
Hmm.
which I
Hmm.
could have done via the tradition, which is much more sophisticated understanding, but I was learning about it in real terms. So again, I was raised in liberal modernity. The idea is, everything's equal, be a nice guy and she'll like you, all this sort of nonsense that you're told. What you learn in the pickup world, the red pill world, is no, be a man, have masculine energy, and women are magnetically attracted to masculine energy. Now, there are many nuances as to what that is exactly, but that's basically what I learned. Non-neediness, being self-sustaining, not emotionally collapsing in front of a woman, learning how to manage yourself emotionally, resourcefully, spiritually, the rest of it. Be confident, charming, funny, all that sort of stuff. Easygoing. This is a really important one to remember, guys. You can have these strong values, hold them with a soft touch. If you have strong values, like a lot of these guys are telling you online, and you try and hold them with a strong touch, you'll freak a woman out because you're too controlling. That's almost tyrannical king energy. The true king, very strong values, soft touch. So it's like, this is what I believe. If you don't, that's cool. Women, it's like catnip to a woman that because it shows you're very balanced, you're very strong, you know what you believe, but you're not going to chase her. You're not going to change yourself for her. 99% of the time, women will find that very alluring. But anyway, I'm out of that stage of my life
It's nice not to
now.
worry about it, isn't it? I said to my partner, who, I have very serious long-term commitment with, I said to her the other day, I'm so glad I'm not on the dating apps now. I'm so glad I'm out of that. And, I just say to the young guys, like, hey, if you've got any kind of masculinity, you're gonna stand out, right? Like it's really, in some ways, it's easy in that sense because it's like you stand out. The other one I'm waiting for is I'm waiting for the women to swing. So at the moment, we have this big difference in politics between young men and young women. I think a lot of young women still are sane and they like men and the sort of trad wife thing, it's a kind of cliche, but it's there. But I think the majority of young women are still sort of left leaning because they think that's the right thing to do. But what we're going to see is as culture shifts, culture is always led by a small group of young men, right? Like as culture shifts, that group of women are just going to en masse just swap sides because they're not really committed to the ideology that exists currently. And also it's profoundly unhealthy for them. Like so many women I coach are like, God, I wish I'd had kids. God, I wish I hadn't given my life to Clive to make Excel spreadsheets. They really see how they've been ripped off. They've been ripped off by liberalism. My friend in Portugal who's getting followed down a street by an immigrant guy, and they're starting to question it. And I think once they're usually a little bit behind the guys on the culture, but once we hit a certain point, and I think it's soon. I think we're going to see sort of young women en masse go whoop to the other side of things.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, again, I think you touched on several key things there. And number one, yeah, I think women, again, broadly speaking, not always, but they are more inclined to follow the dominant ideology of the age, and that's liberalism right now. If that shifts, they may shift. Perhaps most appallingly, a lot of women's nature has been used against them. So, for instance, it's the compassion, the motherly instinct, which they tend to be much higher in, has really been manipulated by the liberal world. It's motherly to care about these million Pakistanis coming in, and you're good if you take care of them. And you do find a lot of the people that will be the most vocal supporters of these are sort of the white middle class women who don't have to live with them. They treat them
Right,
almost
right.
like they're innocent babies. It's almost like a corruption of their motherly instinct, a dark corruption of it. So I think there is that side to it of women, and again, I've seen it myself as well. Many women have been really burnt by the promises of liberal modernity. They didn't choose to have a husband and have kids, and they've given their life to a boss and ridden the cock carousel, as it's sometimes called, and then they're 40 and they don't have anyone, and it can be really sad, and
Mm,
they're sort of ignored now by the system. I do think as well. Hopefully there will be a shift, but again, unfortunately, will have to get dark before people will be woken up to that shift. Because again, there's one thing that courses through ideology, and that's pain. Pain takes no prisoners. It doesn't matter if you're right wing or left wing, it will just whack you. And when it hits you, you have a choice. You either acknowledge and learn its lessons and move on, or it will just destroy you to death. And that's really going to be the battle for Western men and women. It also leads me to another point, which I think is really key, the future of dating now and in the future. And you mentioned, if a guy has masculine aptitudes, he's going to do a bit better. I think that's true, but I would say don't take that literally in the sense of take masculinity. I think you
right.
take that as read in what you're saying. I think there's something to be said for it's more about being who you are in your true essence. So it's something like, knowing what you are as a man, knowing your energies, king, warrior, magician, lover, where you're strong, where you need to work. This idea that's sometimes put forward in the red pill world, I'm certainly not saying you're doing this, but it's online where they'll push this idea of this sort of bro who's like so tough, yeah. It's like that's bullshit. That's not going to get you a good woman, believe me. And I've been through all of this. I did the kind of Goggins thing and like super
Right, right.
hardcore, and then the Russell Brand thing of being charming. And I found just my own way myself. And it's sometimes necessary to go into those energies to wear them for a bit and find what bits can you keep, what bits do you have to jettison. And you find, if you like, that true man within you, which again, I believe happens naturally when you get the ego out of the way. But the point I'm making is, as we see these changes and men are finding themselves and women are finding themselves, we do have to give each other a bit of leeway. Because when all is said and done, men and women need each other, on a divine, universal level, and also on a practical, sexual, and human level. And we are going to have to say, like, look, we understand we got things wrong. This isn't about going back to, silence, wench. That's not what I'm advocating. I'm advocating, it's coming back to love, understanding our natures, understanding balance between the two sides, and understanding that, look, we're both going to have our histories 99% of the time in this day and age. We've both been led down the garden path. And if we're to really meaningful heal ourselves and our culture and our collective, we're going to have to give each other a bit of a chance.
And if in doubt, marry a beautiful Polish girl, right?
Well, we're both with Eastern European women, I think, aren't
A sudden penchant. Richard, before we wrap up, like I just want to kind of give you some love for what you're doing. I really enjoy listening to both. You have two YouTube channels. One seems a bit more like current events, a bit more political. One's this deep spiritual stuff. I think they're both great. I listen to them almost every day. As much for the tone, like you were just expressing there, like, hey, men and women need each other. We don't have to be in some kind of, it's like the maddest war ever. Men and women at war. Is that who benefits from that? It ain't men and women. Like
Well,
that's
there are
crazy.
certain people who do, but yeah,
Yeah, yeah, there are
yeah,
people who would, right? They can sell you stuff. I often feel like the state is a replacement for the husband in many
yeah.
cases. Yeah, tell us a little about what you're up to. So the online stuff, say a little bit of, not just plug it, but say a little bit about the channel, what you do, and also maybe offline stuff as well.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been something which has all been culminating in my life at the moment. I've had many hours of contemplation over the past year or so where I've been thinking, look, where's all this going and what is it I'm trying to say and do? And I think there is something in me where, as you can probably tell, I'm trying to listen to that voiceless voice within, the voice that guides you to do what is necessary rather than perhaps what you want to do or is the most algorithmically friendly. And I am I've inquired quite deeply, and I do believe the West collectively is on the verge of this rebirth, and I do want to be a small part of that. So that's really the structure behind the two channels where they unify. Again, Richard the Fourth, the main channel, is more topical events of the day from I guess you could say, a trad perspective. And the sister channel, the Sacred Way, tends to be more for the people who are really into this, maybe like yourself, who are really on a deeper level, intrigued in all this stuff. What does it actually mean? Tradition, what does it mean to spiritually unfold or evolve, however you want to see it? And what does it mean when we speak about masculine initiation? Why is that important? And I'm kind of hoping that in time, the Sacred Way, the second channel, becomes more dominant because this is where you can actually do something. It's where you can take some practical action and think, well, this is how I'm evolving my life instead of just watching endless content, which is important. Don't get me wrong. It's really important to diagnose what's going on and have a laugh sometimes. And sometimes, unfortunately, look at the really hard news to view. We also need something that men can lean back on, especially the younger men who are looking for that sense of meaning. So that's the aim with the channels, and in time that will move towards the Substack, where I'm aiming to build more of a community of men where they can connect on these issues, share their challenges, align with tradition, reawaken that wisdom. Big plans for that down the line. It's hard to invest too much time with two channels a job and Substack, but I'm hoping in time I'll be able to do this solely.
I don't know how you
Pers-
produce so much, man. Like your videos are beautiful as well. There's often this like nice, beautiful kind of British countryside stuff on there and lots of graphics. And you're making like one or two kind of 10, 15-minute videos a day, right?
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think as I've said to many people before, that the thing is, it's like 10 years worth of learning and ideas and putting things together in my own life and trialing things. So I'm kind of ready to hit record and go. Most of the time, I just have a
Mm.
couple of bullet points and just go. And a lot of the time, the news itself sort of acts as a good barometer because it'll give me that thing to riff on. The sacred way is a bit harder because I have to wait for that movement within where you're like, okay, that's the topic I'm going to do, and I almost wait for God, if you will. But with the Richard the Fourth one, it's more topical. So yeah, whatever's happened that day, I'll report on. And me personally, yeah, I mean, I'm 38 now, so I'm really sensing a big change in myself. 30 was a big shift, as I alluded to earlier, really moving from boy to man. I think where I'm going now is a real another big step into a deeper spiritual expression and perhaps alignment with tradition. I don't quite know what that means yet, and you never really do, but that's probably the core of my life right now, as well as embracing fatherhood, which is a wonderful thing, and getting out there in what's left of England in nature and connecting with as many like-minded men as I can.
Richard, I'm so glad I reached out to you and we've had a couple of chats offline as well. I just, you make me feel some hope for the world, a bit less alone, and I super appreciate your work. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.